Welcome back to the program. You're listening to Business in Vancouver on Roundhouse Radio 98.3. We're the daily business news program from Business in Vancouver newspaper and BIV.com. I'm Kirk LaPointe.
I'm Tyler Orton. I think to the relief of some parents, kids are going back to school next week, Kirk.
Relief is really one of the milder words you can use in that one.
But I also know, look, parents might be stressing out right now.
Well, now, because it's like they have to figure out financing.
Yeah.
And in some cases, I would suspect that a lot of parents did not do adequate planning, and they're suddenly going to realize that their bank accounts are being emptied by a combination of tuition and living expenses for things like post-secondary.
Maybe it's a good time to encourage those kids to go off and travel. They can pay for their own travel somehow.
That's right.
But for those that are going back to school, we've got a special guest with us today here to give some advice to a lot of parents and children out there is Tea Nicola. She's a CEO of Vancouver-based WealthBar. Tea, thanks for joining us on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
Are you speaking to nervous parents right now? Is now about the time of year that you get that?
Well, it's definitely on top of mind right now, and a lot of parents are starting to consider putting away some of the money for the post-secondary education, especially when their children start going to school. That kind of becomes a hot topic.
This is the back-to-school period, but maybe it's also a good idea to think of it as the back-to-savings period as well, where you start to actually think through what the consequences are of inactivity around your child's education. So we've got these great vehicles, RESPs, in this country. We've talked before about this. They're not perfect, but they are pretty splendid ways of ensuring that you can protect those savings for later.
Absolutely. If you save inside a RESP or registered educational savings plan, the government will kick in 20 cents for every dollar that you save in up to $2,500
Making 20 cents on your dollar right away.
Exactly.
Not many investments can do that instantly.
Exactly. And then in addition to that, in BC, once your child turns 6, the government will just give you $1,200 just because.
I like that idea.
That's right. I can't remember when I turned 6 that I got $1,200 somehow in the family. But these are pretty flexible funds. Ultimately, they don't have to go directly to, say, a post-secondary institute for tuition. They can be used essentially to live life during that period when you are in the institute.
Yes, the only condition is that your child has to be registered at a post-secondary education institution that is listed on the approved by the Canadian government.
But that's a pretty good.
It's a really broad range
of them.
It's not just universities; it's colleges, trade schools. A lot of things qualify.
And to reflect the more modern approach with a lot of mature students, these are not necessarily just for those that are coming out of high school, of a high school age. You can use RESPs up to when?
Up to age 35, actually.
Yeah,
so if your child does want to go travel for a year and maybe make some money on their own.
5 years.
Or 5 years or 15.
Just saying.
Yeah.
You really want them out of the house, don't you?
Once they're out, they're not getting back in, right? I mean, that's the way it works, right? No, it doesn't work like that. You're always welcoming your children back.
Of course.
That being said, it's a nice flexible instrument that way.
Absolutely.
Considering what we're now facing, though, as a society, with the need for lifelong learning, and the fact that some of us are afraid that even the jobs that our children might have might be automated at some point, do we need better vehicles to ensure that did not just take us to age 35, but to almost take us through life in terms of pursuit of education?
Yes, I agree. I think we need better vehicles, but there's also programs out there that exist. One of them being the Lifelong Learning Plan, where anybody can borrow money for the education later in life from their RSP, much the same way that you can borrow to purchase your first home, like the home buyer's plan.
So you can withdraw it without a tax penalty, without treating it as income.
Correct.
And you just have to pay it back over what?
Over 15 years.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So it's basically a very nice way to kind of supplement your funding.
Well, I got to ask Tea, though. I mean, why aren't we hearing more about this from banks, for example? I mean, it seems like a great program.
To be honest with you, I don't know. I don't know why banks are not making a bigger deal about this. I don't think that traditionally RESPs, are relatively low amount accounts. So I don't know. I can't explain to you why banks are not saying. I can just say that I'm an avid supporter of financial literacy, and that's why I want to talk about this as much as possible.
We often talk to millennials about things like RRSPs and how a little bit each month really accumulates nicely. What do you think's the right amount to think about with, say, a child of age 4 or 5, where you're going to get this $1,200 benefit in about a year's time? But how much do you think makes some sense at this stage, of that stage of life, in order to accumulate an appropriate amount so that by the time that child is a post-secondary age, you're largely covering the bill?
Right. So about $200 is sort of the magic number to maximize the grant. And one of the tricks that I often tell parents that they should do is they should get the universal childcare benefit to actually just divert it to an RESP. So you basically get your RESP funded 100% by the government.
Nice.
Which is really nice.
Yeah, that's really good.
But I mean, for a lot of parents, I mean, $200 a month per child, that does add up. I mean, are you seeing trends when it comes to how many people are actually able to put away that amount of money?
So of those that open an RESP and have some regular contribution, it is normally around the amount that they put away. Some people open an RESP just to get the $1,200 grant, which is totally fine. But the problem is that not a lot of percentage-wise, not a large percentage of population even has the account.
Yeah.
So I guess I would just encourage people to open it, because there are ways to, birthday money, Christmas money. You can just put it in. Government kicks in the grant. You get $1,200, and it all adds up.
Yeah, it's like a TFSA or something, and the bank has the use of your money. It's not like you're going to be using that money in the meantime. The banks ought to be, as Tyler put it, they ought to be encouraging people to be using these vehicles, because after all, they're using the money for probably 10 or 15 years before you're going to come back and deal with it.
Well, in certain cases, if it's sitting in cash, but we have actually in Canada relatively strict laws about how much the institution can access funds inside registered investment accounts. And I would also encourage parents who do open an RESP not to keep it in cash, but to actually find like a balanced investment vehicle to actually
get some. So while you're putting the money in, also find a vehicle to make it grow so it doesn't just stay statically.
Correct. You want to at least keep in par with inflation so the purchasing power remains the same, but you can also get some more money out of it as well.
Would it make sense to front load whatever you put down into it, or does it even matter if you're accumulating this over the course of maybe a decade plus?
Mathematically speaking, it is actually the best to just plop in $50,000 the day that your child is born. However, that's neither realistic, nor does it actually maximize the government grant. So putting $210 away every month is actually the most optimal way to to save for the education, and the government gives you the most.
It wouldn't be a bad christening if you had $50,000 right then and there.
Right. Yeah.
At $50,000 on the day one, you can send your child to an Ivy League school and not have much of a problem.
Plan for that. You go ahead, try it. What happens though if you have to withdraw some money early? What happens here? Is it taxed as income?
It is taxed as income. You can't really. It would be taxed as income. Government would claw all the benefits back. There's a bit of punitive measures here for withdrawing money early, and you certainly, when you withdraw money, your child has to withdraw it.
And if your child doesn't pursue a post-secondary education, you have to wind down those funds at some point, obviously by age 35.
Correct. So if your child has not gone into any post-secondary education by the time they're 35, you can roll over the RESP into your RRSP.
Oh, you can?
Yes, assuming you have room. Yeah. The government will claw the grant back, but you will enjoy the growth on the funds that you have already saved.
So they take the $1,200 plus interest or something like that back? Or just $1,200?
I'm talking about the Canada Education Savings Grant.
Oh, so the 20%.
The 20%. Yeah, they will take that.
All right.
For sure.
I mean, are there different options depending on the province, though? I mean, we're talking about the grant here, but I mean, does BC offer something, versus, say, Alberta or Newfoundland?
So BC has the $1,200, and that's unique to BC. For example, Saskatchewan has an additional 10 cents on the top of the 20 cents that the government gives you for every dollar, but it is getting canceled at the end of the year. So I guess it was a little too rich. So, and then, those would be the two provinces that have the most.
I know this sounds like a very generous program in a certain respect, but when you're thinking long-term strategy as a country, where we have to have a more highly educated and competitive workforce, isn't this just like a very smart investment in our future?
Absolutely. I think that we really need to think about how we educate our children and raise the level of education
and
of
not
the
saddle them with
population.
student debt.
Not saddle them with student debt, and support them in any way we can. And really, the government should actually contribute more than the Canada Education Savings Grant currently does, in order to ensure that more and more people get more education.
It's interesting to think about what my parents did. We essentially had kind of a deal. They had been saving up for this, but then they had the deal, essentially we'll do 50-50. And so I had not been saving up, so I was not nearly as prepared. So it was a lot of summers working. But I mean, how common is it for like parents and children to come to similar sorts of arrangements like this?
It depends on the income level and the cash flow ability. I think a lot of parents and students resort to the governmental loans, and those are favorable, and but they do saddle people with debt. And I mean, I'm no spring chicken. I've graduated from university like 15 years ago, and I just paid off my student loans.
Really?
So,
Yeah.
Yeah. In August, I got the letter. Your student loans are paid in full just now.
Did you go out for dinner to celebrate, or?
Yeah, it's just one of those kind of like, phew, it's done. So, but it does take a while. It's been about 15 years.
Yeah, I mean, I hope that what we're reaching in this economy is an understanding that education, first of all, ought to be very affordable in this country. And if it's not affordable, that there need to be instruments that encourage people to avert the student debt issue. Because you can see, particularly in the United States, where tuition is much higher in the Ivy League institutions, particularly, that it just buckles you for many decades. You never really bail yourself out from it. It's always an obligation that you have, and especially it limits the agency that you have in the first kind of jobs that you take, where you've really got to hit the jackpot quickly.
Correct, and it's not just that, but it's once that 6-month clock is done, when the government defers your interest and payments, like, they want the money, and it doesn't matter that you don't have a job or you don't have the high paying job, and then you have to get into this, and student debt is punitive against your credit rating. If you don't pay it, it will affect it. It can kind of really damage you for a really long time.
So the message to young families is, consider as you grow, the notion that you've got to place some investment in as you go along, and you have to find the means by which to do it, because it's a matter of pay us now or pay us later.
Correct. And I just think that the message is to start, to make a decision to start, and then to seek advice from an advisor and actually find out what is the right amount. How can we distribute the saving dollars among the accounts to meet all of our goals and stuff like that.
And this is where the grandparents come in.
Exactly.
Right. Well, excellent, Taya. Thank you so much for joining us on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
That's Tea Nicola. She's a CEO of Vancouver-based WealthBar, and you're listening to Business in Vancouver on Roundhouse Radio 98.3. I'm Tyler Orton.
And I'm Kirk LaPointe. Stay with us here at Roundhouse Radio 98.3.